Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. It's always interesting to follow Mr. Bennett, because there are times when I listen to Mr. Bennett's contribution and I think, you know, I might not know what I'm talking about, and then I remember it's Mr. Bennett. And I realise that actually, for example, the little statement Mr. Bennett just made with regard to this bill and around that that the Green Party member was wrong when he talked about democracy and how there wasn't actually any democracy with regard to student representation or staff representation because they were appointed. Obviously, Mr. Bennett and the notes he has got, either he's read them wrong or he needs to replace his researchers. There is a seat, what we're talking about, Mr. Bennett, is a seat being placed there for a student representative, which is then elected by the student body to that seat, Mr. Bennett. And I commend Mr. Foster Bell for his speech. He managed to find the single Māori woman that has been appointed by this Minister of Tertiary Education in the whole of New Zealand. So well done, Mr. Foster Bell. Good piece of research there. You did have to search for it, guarantee it. You did have to search for it. I want to commend Mr. Cunliffe on trying to do the Minister of Tertiary Education a favour, of giving the Minister of Tertiary Education an opportunity to undo another cock-up that the Minister has made, all right, another mistake that the Minister has made inside amending the Education Act 1989. Now, just while we're talking about amending the Education Act 1989, there's so many things that have been contributed that make it easy. Mr. Foster Bell said that the reason why this bill should not be supported is because it's only just been amended, so therefore it does not make sense to go and amend an act that's just been amended. However, this government is in the middle of quite incredibly pressured consultation around amending exactly the act that Mr. Foster Bell says we shouldn't touch because it's just been amended, and only yesterday they announced that they're putting another piece of legislation to amend this act that they amended only earlier this year. So you can't have it both ways, Mr. Foster Bell. Either it's all right for us to actually, for the opposition to say that there is a mistake inside this bill, very similar to legislative changes around the 7-year cap, for example, and to give Mr. Joyce the opportunity to actually admit he made a mistake, or it's not okay for the government to go ahead and decide that they're going to continue to amend the Education Act 1989. Mr. Foster Bell's conversation also, if you listen to it carefully, argued for exactly this piece of legislation. He argued by mentioning the number of universities, predominantly in America and in the United Kingdom, where there was no student voice on those councils. He argued exactly for the reason why it should be required that there be a seat for the student voice and a seat for the staff voice on university councils. Mr. Bennett, it was Mr. Williamson, for example, talked about how the right believed in the right to choose. And again, Mr. Williamson obviously didn't really read his notes. He didn't understand what had happened under the changes that had happened earlier this year to the Education Act. The governments didn't get their choice, Mr. Williamson. Sorry, the universities didn't get their choice, Mr. Williamson. 100% of the universities submitted and said, please don't make this change. If the government, if the right, as Mr. Williamson said, truly stood for the right to choose, they would have supported that university voice, they would have supported the student voice, they would have supported the staff voice and their choice to have the council structure remain the same. What this does, what Mr. Cunliffe is trying to do, is to undo a mistake. He's trying to give the government the opportunity to put back what is democracy, Mr. Bennett, into the representation of those councils. He's trying to give the government an opportunity to say, we should have listened in the beginning, we should have heard and realised that without this protection, we've had one series of elections, and the government members have been lauding it that there's this voice here and two voices over here. Without these protections, Mr. Foster Bell has just told us that as we look to go forward, that voice will disappear.
Melissa Lee.